I never watched the Disney movie Hercules as a kid. That probably sounds absolutely bizarre, right? I did watch plenty of Disney movies as a child, that just didn't happen to be one of them. However, I am familiar with the Greek myth of Hercules, so naturally at some point I was going to want to see what Disney did with it, if only to cringe at how badly they got it wrong, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I'm cringing at how badly they got it wrong. However, I'm not entirely just freaking out over how they got it wrong, because I do have to acknowledge it is a kid's movie, and Hercules is a myth that honestly I'm shocked that they were able to adapt as a kid's movie because there are just so many aspects of it that are not child friendly. So I'm kind of going to be looking at that as well and like, what did they do to make it more appropriate for kids? Honestly, if it were me, I wouldn't have picked Hercules as a story to adapt for kids. Just between everything that happens in it, there's so much that's just so hard to explain away. And basically what Disney did is they told a very different story that hits some of the same basic plot points or ideas. Yeah, it's not the myth of Hercules as you know it if you've studied, actual mythology. It's a completely different story. There are, however, a lot of references to the original story of Hercules and to classical mythology in general. One thing that I thought was actually really cool was having the Muses be the ones telling the story. The Muses were seen as sort of the inspiration behind all forms of artwork, from poetry to dance to music, and they often were invoked at the beginning of, for example, epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. So having the Muses frame the story and be the ones telling it was actually spot on. At first I thought it was odd that there were only 5 muses when really there should have been 9 of them, but I actually was able to figure out which ones they probably were supposed to be. And it kind of works. Like, for instance, the muses representing song and dance were probably meant to be among the 5 because the muses, as well as other characters, sing and dance throughout the story. On the other hand, the muses representing things like astronomy, tragedy, or hymns probably were not meant to be there. Because astronomy has a little bit to do with the story, just in that they make a constellation of Hercules and the whole thing with the planets aligning, but otherwise not really that important, and, it's not a tragedy, and it's not a hymn, and it's not real history, so, I can go with there only being 5 muses there, because I think it actually does kind of work. Although it may be that I'm just way overthinking that, and what they were really going for was just have a manageable number of characters to animate. I don't know. Anyway. With the muses out of the way, let's talk about the story. The backstory with Zeus fighting the Titans is mythologically accurate, but it leaves out some important details. One of the most important details left out is that Zeus's older siblings were eaten by Kronos, the leader of the Titans. Kronos had heard a prophecy that one of his children would eventually be the one to take him down, and so he decided that he just wasn't going to allow his children to, actually grow up, so he swallowed them whole. They were gods, so they didn't die, but they were just, inside of his stomach. Until his wife got fed up with that and hid her latest child away. And that child grew up to be Zeus, who was the one who took down the Titans. Now, that's a little bit gruesome and unpleasant to think about, for a kid's movie, but it is really important for one specific reason. Hades. Hades is Zeus's brother, and in the myth, he was one of the children swallowed by Kronos. He has as much reason to hate the Titans as anyone, and nowhere that I can think of in any part of Greek mythology does Hades try to release the Titans or do anything, to bring about a second war against them. I get that Hades is an easy villain for works based on mythology, and I understand why they didn't want to use Hera as the villain, even though she's the closest thing to a god or goddess as the villain of Hercules' story, in actual mythology. I get that they didn't want to get into the reasons why Hera didn't like Hercules. Hades releasing the Titans? Are you kidding me? And for that matter, what are the Titans doing here anyway? Like, why are they part of this story, aside from just as the backstory for how the Olympians became the pantheon that the Greeks worshipped? Hercules fighting the Titans is not part of the original Hercules myth. What on earth was going on there? One of the biggest inaccuracies, though, was having Hercules be the son of Zeus and Hera. In the myth, Hercules is not the son of Zeus and Hera. He's the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. And that's a very common occurrence in Greek mythology, Zeus having children with mortal women. Hera is never amused, and she's definitely not amused in this situation. She is actually, in the myths, she is the one who sends the snakes after Hercules. Not Hades. Hera. She's also the one who drives him insane so that he murders his wife and children, and that's something that you certainly don't see in the Disney movie. They do show him doing the 12 labors, but only as part of his quest to become a true hero and rejoin his parents on Mount Olympus, not as penance for accidentally killing his family. Do you see why I said earlier that if I had to pick a Greek myth to adapt as a children's movie, it would not be Hercules? There are so many others that would be so much easier to make child-friendly, and I'm not going to get too much into that right now because that's actually a whole other video that I'm going to make. But for right now, let's just say I can understand why they didn't want to have the real reason behind the 12 labors of Hercules in a movie made for children. Now, in the myths, Hercules does become immortal and go to live on Mount Olympus with the gods at the end, which is actually something that he refuses to do at the end of this one, choosing a mortal life with his love interest Meg instead. But that's his goal throughout the entire story, and he does have the option of, achieving that goal at the end. He just finds that his priorities have changed. So that's something that's actually pretty accurate, except it's not because he's the son of Zeus and Hera in the myths. That doesn't have anything to do with it, because he's not the son of Zeus and Hera. I wonder if it could have been done better if Hera had been like an evil stepmother type. Like, if they had said that Zeus loved a mortal woman and she died because she was mortal, and then he remarried to a goddess, and then had Hera be, like the mythological equivalent of Snow White's stepmother or whatever. It wouldn't work timeline-wise because Hera was married to Zeus way before he ever met Hercules' mother. But I don't think that they really cared about respecting the timeline, and I will get into that later. So it would have at least been somewhat more accurate than saying that she was his loving mother. Alright, let's talk about Hades. Out of the Greek pantheon, Hades is the one that's the easiest to make into a villain in modern-day stories because he was the god of death and the underworld, and we find that creepy. However, Hades doesn't play a big role in the original story of Hercules. He does appear in it kind of briefly during one of the 12 labors of Hercules that has to do with the three-headed dog Cerberus. But he definitely is not the one causing most of Hercules' problems. As I said before, that was Hera. Almost everything that Hades does in this movie is completely inaccurate, not just in terms of him not having that big of a role in Hercules' story, but just in terms of his portrayal in Greek mythology in general. I mean, spoiler alert, none of the gods and goddesses from Greek mythology are ever portrayed as just totally benign and benevolent, and their interactions with human beings often don't go too well for those people. However, portraying Hades as the enemy of the other gods and trying to overthrow Zeus and unleashing the Titans and all of that, none of that is really accurate, so, I think that they were really just going more for stereotypical villain as opposed to really trying to portray what Hades was like according to mythology. In fact, I kind of got the impression that they were going for like Hades as the devil, which really doesn't work because in Greek mythology they only believed in one underworld, one afterlife. It might be a very pleasant place or a very unpleasant place depending on how you had lived your life. But the whole thing with like Megara selling her soul to Hades to save her lover, that doesn't work because in Greek mythology, Hades got everyone's soul after they died unless they were like literally made into a god like Hercules was. Now, I do think I know which myth they got the inspiration for that idea from, but they really interpreted it very differently. The story that I think it's inspired by is about a young woman called Alcestis. Alcestis is married to a man who has found out through various plot-related stuff that I'm not going to get into that he's going to die soon. And he's been promised that if he can find someone to willingly take his place, then he won't have to die yet. He's not able to find anyone who's willing to agree until his wife Alcestis volunteers. However, when Thanatos, the Greek god of death, comes, yes, Thanatos, not Hades. Hades was the king of the underworld, but Thanatos was the one who would come after your soul like the Grim Reaper. In any case, Alcestis volunteered to die in her husband's place, Thanatos came for her, and Hercules fought Thanatos in order to save Alcestis, and he succeeded and neither she nor her husband had to die that day. However, she did not become Hercules' love interest. She stayed with her husband and lived happily ever after, and notice that she bargained her life, like as in the time of her death, rather than her soul. It was just kind of a given that both of their souls were going to Hades eventually, and it was a matter of when. So let's talk about Meg. Meg is Hercules' love interest, and she's kind of loosely based on his first wife in the myths. He was married multiple times. His first wife was Megara, who he married and had kids with, and then violently murdered in a fit of madness brought on by Hera. So, yeah, she's clearly not really that much inspired by the mythological character, other than her name and the fact that she is Hercules' love interest. Aside from Alcestis, whose story I was telling just now, Meg is also very strongly reminiscent of Ariadne from the story of Theseus and Ariadne. Like Meg, Ariadne took a huge risk and made a huge sacrifice for a man that she was in love with. In her case, it wasn't her soul that she bargained away. She gave him the secret to escape her father's labyrinth alive and asked that he take her with him and marry her. He promised to do that, but then, on their way home, he abandoned her on an island. Depending on the version of the myth, she might have gotten together with someone else at the end, Dionysus, who was the Greek god of wine. So the idea of a woman who gave up a lot because she was in love and was burned by it but is now falling in love again, I think that connects very strongly with the myth of Theseus and Ariadne, even if it wasn't really meant to, and I'm not sure how strongly inspired by it the story of Meg was. And then finally, she reminds me a lot of Eurydice as well, in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. The story goes like this. Orpheus is in love, his fiancée Eurydice dies before their wedding, and because he is so grief-stricken, he goes all the way down to the underworld for her, and he bargains with Hades to let her live a little bit longer, to let her live, a full life with him before she dies. Hades agrees, but there's kind of a catch. Orpheus has to walk out of the underworld, not looking back, trusting that she's following after him, and if he looks back over his shoulder, she'll have to stay there. Which, guess what happens? Now, that's not exactly like how it goes down with Hercules and Meg, because Hades is the villain in this story, and so he's going to do a lot worse than just give them a test that Orpheus fails. In fact, when he agrees that Hercules can save Meg, he plans for Hercules to be dead before he reaches her. And then, of course, Hercules succeeds and is able to save her, which doesn't happen in the myth of Orpheus. However, the idea of losing someone that you're in love with and going down to the underworld to try and bring them back, that definitely is reminiscent of that myth. So I do think that Megara is a character who seems to fit pretty well within the context of Greek mythology. She's very reminiscent of several other myths. The whole selling your soul thing doesn't really work in the way that they've portrayed it, and she doesn't have all that much in common with the actual Megara from mythology, but she does have quite a bit in common with several other mythological characters. One thing that I thought was hilarious was when Phil, Hercules' mentor, is listing all of the failed heroes that he supposedly trained before Hercules. And by the way, I should point out that this guy did not train all these heroes, and they did not all come before Hercules in the timeline. In fact, Hercules was one of the Argonauts, so Jason would not have done what he was most famous for. And Hercules came before the Trojan War, so neither would Odysseus or Achilles if they've even been born yet. The timeline really doesn't work as far as these supposed failed heroes that this guy trained in the past. In any case, though, I think it's really ironic that this guy dreams of having a constellation of a hero that he trained in the sky. Because, first of all, having a constellation made of you wasn't always a good thing, and secondly, there were already constellations relating to several of the heroes that he claimed to have trained. Now, the one relating to Theseus, the Corona Borealis, I can understand seeing as like a failure, because that didn't have anything to do with Theseus's accomplishments. It was the crown that Dionysus gave to Ariadne when he asked her to marry him and become a goddess. Now, why did Dionysus ask Ariadne to marry him and become a goddess? Because Theseus abandoned her, so, shame on you, Theseus, that doesn't count as an accomplishment for this Phil guy, and let's move on. Perseus, though, got constellations relating to his wife, his mother-in-law, and one of the monsters that he slayed. There is no Perseus constellation, but there definitely are constellations that reflect on Perseus's heroic actions. And there is no constellation of Jason either, but there are 3 constellations that are supposed to be the keel, stern, and sail of the Argo. So again, constellations that reflect on what that hero was most famous for. Also, I should add that not all of those failed heroes that he trained were actually failures. A lot of them did what they set out to do. Perseus did save Andromeda, he did become king. Theseus, while I don't think much of his actions toward Ariadne, and by the way, dude, change the color of your sails, he did kill the Minotaur though, he did escape the labyrinth, and he did end the tribute that his people were forced to pay to King Minos. Odysseus was the one who came up with the Trojan horse thing, and while he was stranded at sea for a long time, he did eventually make it back home to Ithaca. Achilles did die in battle, but the point where he decided to rejoin the fighting was one of the big turning points of the Trojan War. And the Argo was on a quest for the Golden Fleece, which Jason did successfully obtain and bring back home. These guys didn't fail. Some of them lived longer than others, but they didn't fail in their quests in the way that Phil implies. I was impressed by the amount of research that they appeared to have done in terms of referencing myths and getting little details right that weren't even necessarily related to the Hercules story. Like, for instance, the Fates having only one eyeball that they pass around between them and weaving the future and using shears to cut the thread of life. All that was wonderful. A lot of the references to background characters were pretty well done, the roles played by, like, Hermes and Hephaestus, for instance. During the song I Won't Say I'm in Love, Meg backing up into Cupid's arrow and it, like, poking her, I thought that that was a wonderful detail. Even some of the things relating to the Hercules myth, like the references to some of the 12 labors, even though they didn't really get into the reason for the 12 labors, or the 2 snakes that attacked him as a baby, even though they were sent by the wrong person. Clearly they had done their research. Clearly they knew what they were doing and had, at least looked up some of this stuff and didn't just make up crap right off the top of their heads. However, what I felt like was they did their research, they took out all the stuff that they didn't think was appropriate for kids, they dumped it all in a blender, and they made a smoothie. And the smoothie doesn't resemble any of the original myths, it's just this new thing that you might like or you might not like, but it's not. It's this weird mixture. So there you have it, folks. Disney Hercules, child-friendly Greek mythology smoothie. In any case, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.